Corporal Nathan Reed, a figure forged in discipline, stepped onto the gravel with a deliberate crunch, his sharp jawline set firmly, a testament to his resolve. The barracks that stood before him, Barracks Delta, was a decrepit edifice, a shadow of its former glory, shrouded in the impenetrable darkness of a moonless night. The building, clad in peeling paint and with its skeletal windows gaping, seemed to scrutinize him with a malevolent interest, as if deciding the nature of his fate within its walls. Reed's steel-gray eyes, usually confident and assessing, flickered with a rare glint of apprehension as he surveyed the barracks. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl and the soft, nervous banter of the soldiers he was joining. As the murmurs of his new comrades floated to him, laden with tales of unexplained noises and ghostly sightings, Reed felt an involuntary shiver snake down his spine. They spoke of the building with a mixture of respect and fear, their voices tinged with the unease that only the unknown can elicit. The air was thick with the musk of mildew and lost time, a pungent reminder that this place had been witness to countless seasons, countless footsteps, some perhaps which had never truly departed. The unease in Reed's gut twisted tighter, a cold, serpentine knot that seemed to feed on the growing sense of dread. The ancient structure, with its storied past, loomed over him, its presence almost sentient, as if it held breaths and whispers of those who had once called it home. As he stepped forward, his boots scraping against the gritty path, the whispers of the living soldiers fell away, and Reed couldn't shake the feeling that the true occupants of Barracks Delta were yet to make their presence known. The clock had barely struck midnight when Corporal Nathan Reed, feeling the weight of his fatigue-dampened uniform, reported for his inaugural guard shift at Barracks Delta. The air was still, as if the night itself was holding its breath, and Reed's footsteps were muffled against the old, worn floors as he made his way to the duty post. There, he was greeted by the stooped silhouette of Sergeant Wilkes, a man whose graying hair and deep-set eyes bore witness to countless sleep-deprived nights. Sergeant Wilkes's face, a tapestry of wrinkles carved by years of service and strain, creased further into a semblance of a grim smile as he acknowledged Reed's salute. In the dim light, his eyes seemed to retreat into shadowed hollows, reflecting a wariness that was contagious. They spoke in a conspiracy of whispers, the words barely rising above the hum of silence that enveloped the barracks. Wilkes recounted incidents with a matter-of-fact tone that belied the extraordinary nature of his claims, fleeting glimpses of spectral figures that danced in the edge of vision, elusive yet persistent, disembodied commands that echoed from the depths of deserted quarters. As Reed absorbed these accounts, each word was like a brushstroke, painting a surreal tableau of the uncanny occurrences that marred the barracks. It was a narrative punctuated by the sergeant's haunted, sidelong glances toward the darkened corners and the empty doorways they kept watch over. That night, after the shift had ended, Reed retreated to his bunk, a sparse and uninviting alcove set against the cold, impersonal walls of his room. Sleep, when it came, brought him no rest. Instead, his slumber was invaded by vivid dreams that wove themselves into the fabric of his reality. He dreamt of soldiers, spectral echoes of men lost to wars long since faded from living memory. They appeared in tattered, archaic uniforms that spoke of different eras, each face a mask of solemnity. They called to him, voices distant yet compelling, urging him to fall in line with their phantom ranks. In his dream, he marched alongside them, the rhythm of their boots a haunting cadence that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of Barracks Delta. Their faces, indistinct yet familiar, peered at him with eyes that held the weight of untold stories, of lives abruptly severed yet unwilling to be forgotten. And as he woke, Reed was left with an unsettling certainty that the line between his dreams and the veiled truths of the barracks was perilously thin. Corporal Nathan Reed sat down for a meal in the mess hall, a place usually filled with the raucous sounds of camaraderie and the rich aromas of cooking food. But today, it felt as though a shroud of unease had been cast over the room. Reed's senses were heightened. His training had taught him to be observant, but now each detail seemed magnified in a way that made his skin crawl. The usual chatter seemed subdued, and the clink of cutlery against the plates resonated with an unnerving clarity, as if the normal background noise had been hollowed out, leaving space for something else. The shadows in the room were fickle companions to the soldiers. They twisted in the corners of Reed's eyes, elongating and contorting in impossible ways. He saw them swell and retract with each passing moment, crafting silhouettes that bore an uncanny resemblance to human figures. They seemed to be playing a grotesque pantomime, hinting at a presence that was felt but not seen. A presence that left Reed with the chilling sensation of being watched by unseen observers. He tried to shrug off the creeping dread, telling himself that fatigue was playing tricks on his mind, but his attempts to dismiss the feelings were abruptly cut short. The mess hall was suddenly pierced by a scream that clawed its way up from the depths of primal fear, a sound that one could never mistake for anything but sheer terror. It erupted from the direction of the kitchen, seizing the attention of every soul in the room. The cook, a burly man not known for frights or fancies, emerged from the kitchen, his face ashen and eyes wide with disbelief. Between ragged breaths, he stammered out a tale that seemed to defy reality. He swore on his life that he had seen a decapitated head perched atop a stack of canned goods in the pantry. Its eyes, he claimed, were open and staring, filled with an accusatory glare, as though condemning him for some unfathomable sin. The mess hall fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the distant sound of the storm outside, battering against the building, as if it sought entry to witness the macabre tableau within. Reed's meal lay forgotten before him, his appetite usurped by the unfolding nightmare. He knew then that the barracks harbored secrets far darker than he had imagined, and the thought left a cold void in the pit of his stomach. Corporal Nathan Reed's search for answers drove him deeper into the barracks' unnerving mysteries. His quest led him to the bunk of Private Jensen, a soldier whose once bright eyes were now dulled by the things he claimed to have witnessed within these cursed walls. Jensen was a wiry figure, almost boyish in appearance, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen lifetimes beyond his years. Jensen spoke with an unsettling mixture of fear and fascination about his encounters. His tale unfolded one night when he was on duty in the storeroom, an area of the barracks untouched by time, where artifacts of wars long past still resided. There, Jensen had encountered the apparition of a private from the Second World War, a spectral soldier whose ethereal uniform was adorned with the insignias of a bygone era. This ghostly figure paced the same path over and over, as if patrolling a perimeter that no longer existed, murmuring to himself in a loop of eternal vigilance. He seemed to be searching, always searching, for the platoon he had somehow lost touch with in the fog of war and time. Despite his inherent skepticism, Reed was drawn into Jensen's account. There was something in the private's wide, earnest eyes that convinced him there was truth in the midst of the apparent madness. With a mixture of dread and curiosity, Reed resolved to witness this phenomenon for himself. He chose a night when the moon was just a sliver in the sky, its scant light offering little comfort as he made his way to the storeroom. The storeroom was a veritable tomb, a place where relics of violence and valor rested in uneasy silence. Reed felt the temperature drop as he entered, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into his bones, the kind of cold that spoke of the presence of something otherworldly. The air was thick with the musty scent of mothballed uniforms and the distinct, acrid smell of old gunpowder, a smell that had no place in the modern-day military establishment. As the hours ticked by, Reed sat amidst crates of yellowed documents and tarnished medals, each a testament to the valor and horror of war. The stillness was oppressive, the silence a living entity that seemed almost to breathe. And then, amidst the quiet, Reed felt it, a presence, as if the air had suddenly become charged with an electric, expectant energy. It was a sensation that defied logic, a palpable shift that suggested he was no longer alone in the storeroom's gloom. That night, Reed confronted the eerie reality of the barracks, a reality that hung between the corporeal world and the spectral domain. It was an encounter that would challenge his understanding of the possible, blurring the lines between the living and the dead, between history and the haunting present. Corporal Nathan Reed, now wholly entangled in the barracks' spectral enigma, found himself poring over dusty military logs and brittle records in the base's neglected archive. The dimly lit room was crammed with filing cabinets and stacked with papers that had yellowed with age. It seemed untouched by modern hands, a repository of secrets that time had forgotten. His search unearthed a chilling chapter from the Barracks' storied history. During the tumultuous days of a forgotten conflict, Barracks Delta had been the last known location of an entire battalion before they vanished without a trace. The records were vague, details lost, or perhaps deliberately omitted, but what remained suggested a grim scenario, a brutal and desperate standoff. The battalion, surrounded and cut off from any support, made their last stand within the very walls Reed now inhabited. The accounts varied, some mentioning a mysterious fog that descended upon the barracks during the battle, others talking about a strange silence that followed the gunfire, a silence that seemed to swallow the screams and chaos whole. There was talk of a betrayal, a soldier who turned on his own, but the pages bearing his name were torn out, leaving only the ghost of ink and the whisper of conspiracy. That evening, as twilight surrendered to the inky grasp of night, Reed felt the oppressive history of Barracks Delta press in around him. The air grew thick with the residue of past bloodshed and the echo of old battles. The walls themselves seemed to come alive with the energy of the souls who had fought and fallen within them. Reed could almost hear the low murmur of voices, soldiers calling out to one another, their names hanging in the air like a roll call of the damned. These whispers grew into a cacophony that filled the corridors, the names of the lost soldiers becoming clearer, each utterance a spectral fingerprint of the barracks' dark past. As Reed walked through the halls, the air seemed to vibrate with the untold stories of the missing battalion, their fates entwined with the building that had been their last refuge. He felt a creeping sense of connection to these long-gone soldiers, as if by uncovering their history, he had awoken them from a restless slumber. That night, the past and present collided within the haunted confines of Barracks Delta, and Reed knew that the missing battalion's tragic end was more than a forgotten footnote in history. It was a living legacy, etched into the very fabric of the barracks, demanding to be remembered. Each night, as darkness engulfed Barracks Delta, the boundary between the living and the dead frayed, allowing the specters of history to step forth into Reed's world. The ghostly lieutenant, his visage both haunting and haunted, bore the weight of command even in death. His uniform, tattered and scorched, bore silent testimony to the harrowing end his men had met, a tapestry of scorched fabric and metals that had lost their luster, each stain and tear a chapter of war's unforgiving narrative. This phantom officer materialized before Corporal Reed with unsettling regularity, his presence announced by a sudden drop in temperature and the inexplicable scent of wet earth and gun smoke. The lieutenant's eyes, hollow yet piercing, seemed to see right through Reed, reaching into his soul. With a voice that was both a whisper and a command, he recounted the fateful day his unit marched into an ambush, a meticulously planned operation that had promised to be a straightforward mission, but quickly spiraled into catastrophe. Reed listened, spellbound and horrified, as the lieutenant detailed their march through a labyrinth of trenches, the sky an ominous canvas of storm clouds, and artillery fire. The troops had been on edge, sensing an unseen enemy closing in. Then, without warning, the world erupted around them, gunfire from all sides, the air thick with shrapnel and screams, the muddy ground claiming the fallen. The more Reed immersed himself in the lieutenant's tale, the more his own reality began to distort and fray at the edges. He started experiencing the unimaginable terror of those long-lost battles firsthand. He would snap to awareness in the dead of night, his heart racing, sweat drenching his uniform as though he had just scrambled through no man's land. The thunderous roar of artillery shook his bones, and he could feel the disorientation, the primal urge to survive that had gripped those soldiers in their final moments. These spectral battles seeped into Reed's being, each episode leaving him more exhausted than the last, as if he were slowly being consumed by the battalion's last stand. He could hear the lieutenant's desperate orders shouted over the chaos, could see the determined faces of young men resigned to their fates, and feel the grim acceptance of soldiers fighting not for victory, but for each other's last breaths of life. The line between the past and the present was not just blurred, but obliterated for Reed. He was no longer just a witness to these ghostly reenactments. He was a participant, caught in the relentless tide of Barracks Delta's history, which seemed as eager to claim him as one of its own as it was to reveal its long-guarded secrets. Night after night, Corporal Nathan Reed's sleep was disturbed not by dreams, but by a spectral scribe. His notebook, which he kept meticulously by his bedside, a soldier's habit for recording thoughts and orders, began to fill with messages from an unseen hand. The ink that appeared on these pages was aged, its color reminiscent of rust or dried blood, and the handwriting itself bore the character of another time, the script flowing with an antiquated precision that was never taught in Reed's era. Each message was a cryptic directive, as if pieces of a map were being handed to him piece by piece in a supernatural treasure hunt. Beneath the creaking floorboards, one read, lies the heart of Delta's sorrow. Another instructed, seek the place where light does not dare to pierce. Reed felt compelled to follow these enigmatic instructions, drawn by a force that seemed to beckon him to uncover the barracks' deepest secrets. His search led him to the barracks' neglected corners and shadowed recesses, places forgotten by time and avoided by the living. It was beneath the mess hall, after prying up the ancient floorboards that moaned in protest, that Reed discovered a narrow passage descending into darkness. With nothing but a dim flashlight and the pounding of his heart for company, he navigated the claustrophobic tunnel, the earth around him pressing in, as if trying to smother his quest. The tunnel ended abruptly at a bunker, its entrance sealed with a rusted iron door that protested loudly as Reed forced it open. Inside, the air was oppressive, thick with dust and a palpable sense of dread. The bunker was a time capsule, untouched since the war that had birthed it. Maps still clung to the walls, their edges curled and yellowed, marked with urgent scrawls outlining doomed operations. Helmets and rifles lay scattered where they had been dropped in some long-ago moment of alarm, their owners never returning to claim them. In the eerie silence of the bunker, Reed felt as though he was intruding on a sacred tomb. Personal effects were strewn about, a locket containing a faded photograph of a sweetheart, letters curled into tubes, their words of love and hope never reaching their destinations. It was a chamber of last moments, a sanctuary for those who had clung to thoughts of home and peace as chaos raged above. Reed realized that this hidden place was the barracks' beating heart of anguish, a testament to the final hours of those who had once sought refuge within its concrete walls. The cryptic messages in his notebook had led him here, to the epicenter of Barracks Delta's haunted legacy, compelling him to bear witness to the desperation and courage of the souls still lingering in its shadows. Corporal Nathan Reed, driven by a resolve that was part duty, part empathy, and perhaps part a desire to understand his own place in the ranks of those who serve, made preparations for a séance. He enlisted Sergeant Wilkes, who, despite his hardened exterior and initial skepticism, couldn't dismiss the eerie occurrences he himself had experienced within the barracks. Under the faint glow of lanterns in the storeroom-turned sanctuary, they sat at an old wooden table, strewn with objects of significance, medals of valor, dog tags, and faded photographs, offerings to entice the souls of soldiers long gone. The séance began with a heavy air of anticipation. Reed and Wilkes, with hands joined and eyes closed, called out to the spirits that haunted Barracks Delta. It wasn't long before a wind seemed to rise from nowhere, the storeroom's stillness erupting into a cacophony of war's grim orchestra. The rat-tat-tat of machine gun fire, the sharp commands of officers, and the desperate calls of the wounded filled the air, each sound a phantom echo of a battle that should have long since fallen silent. As the intensity of these sounds grew, the air thickened, and the very fabric of reality thinned. Spectral soldiers flickered into existence around them, transparent, yet overwhelmingly present. They were adorned in battle-worn uniforms, their forms punctured by bullet holes and shredded by shrapnel. Bloodied bandages were wrapped around limbs and heads, but it was their eyes that held the most haunting aspect. They were filled with the pain and confusion of men ripped from life's embrace. These apparitions, not quite of the living yet not ready to accept death, paced restlessly, reaching out to Reed and Wilkes with hands that could not touch, their mouths moving in silent entreaty. They were trapped in their last moments, reliving the terror and agony of their untimely ends. Their pleas were not spoken, but Reed felt them as clearly as if they were screams, a psychic cry for the peace they had been denied. It became clear that these soldiers, these young men cut down in the flower of youth, were not aware of their deaths. They believed themselves still locked in the grip of combat, unable to move on from the bunker that had become their tomb. Reed, feeling the weight of their despair, knew he must help bridge the gap between the living and the dead, offering them the solace of acknowledgement and the release of letting go. The séance, far more powerful and harrowing than either Reed or Wilkes could have anticipated, became not just a mediumistic ritual, but a solemn duty to provide reprieve to comrades in arms who had suffered long enough. Reed spoke to them with a voice that was steady despite the palpable dread that filled him, assuring these lost souls that their duty was done, their war was over, and it was time to find rest. The very foundations of Barracks Delta shuddered, as if the building itself was caught in the throes of the spectral battle raging within its walls. Corporal Nathan Reed, face etched with determination, stood as the fulcrum between two worlds that should never have met, the world of the breathing and the realm of lost souls. As Reed's voice rose in command, urging the spirits to recognize their own demise and move on, the air shimmered with a sudden frost, breaths visible in sharp puffs. The walls, stained by time and tragedy, began to peel and crumble, revealing glimpses of the past, flashes of gunfire, the glint of bayonets, and the fear-stricken faces of young soldiers as they met their untimely end. In this liminal space, the ghosts of enemies long dead stormed the dilapidated barracks as if the battle had never ended. German and American soldiers, their uniforms indicative of the Second World War, clashed in a silent and deadly melee, passing through each other with bayonets bared and rifles raised, their faces contorted with the rage and desperation of their final battle. Amidst this chaos, Reed stood firm, his heart pounding against his ribs, his skin prickled with the electric charge of the supernatural. He clutched at the dog tags that hung heavily around his neck, not his own, but those of a fallen comrade, a token he'd found in the storeroom, which seemed to connect him even more deeply to the spectral soldiers before him. With each plea he made for peace, some of the soldiers began to pause, their ethereal forms flickering uncertainly. They turned towards him, their expressions softening as if the fog of war was lifting from their eyes. Reed's words, imbued with the truth of history and the empathy of one soldier to another, reached them, whispering across the decades to penetrate hearts that should no longer beat. Yet, there were those who resisted, their spectral forms emboldened by their refusal to yield to the passage of time. They surged forward, a tide of unrest and violence that threatened to sweep away the tenuous peace Reed fought to establish. The air crackled with the energy of their discontent, and the structure of the barracks groaned under the weight of their unresolved anger. Reed, with a voice that now took on the authoritative timbre of a commander on the battlefield, invoked the memories of home, of peace, of the lives they once had, and the rest they deserved. He appealed to their humanity, their brotherhood, and their shared sacrifices. His words were a balm to some and a clarion call to others, rallying the spirits to his side for one final stand, not against an enemy of flesh and blood, but against the chains of history that bound them to perpetual conflict. The spectral showdown reached its zenith, a crescendo of echoing battle cries and the heart-wrenching sounds of conflict that faded into silence. The dissonant symphony of the past gave way to a stillness that promised the advent of peace, and Reed stood as a beacon of light in the dissipating darkness, a solitary figure binding the wounds of time with sheer will and unspoken solidarity. The pre-dawn stillness of Barracks Delta was as thick as the dust covering its neglected corners, the building now silent as if holding its breath for Corporal Nathan Reed's next discovery. His search for answers had led him to a hidden compartment in the bunker, behind a wall that seemed no different from the others, save for the faintest of drafts that whispered of secrets. Within this clandestine space, Reed found a cache of old moth-eaten documents, reports, orders, and personal letters, their edges nibbled by time. The ink had faded, but not the truth they carried. The documents spoke of a harrowing tale, a mission sacrificed for the greater strategic good, a battalion sent to an ambush, and the subsequent cover-up that buried the betrayal along with the soldiers. Reed pored over these papers by the light of a stuttering flashlight, each word revealing the enormity of the deceit. The soldiers had been pawns in a game they could not win, their valor unseen, their sacrifice unacknowledged. The truth was as raw as it was revelatory, and Reed knew what he must do. With the dawn approaching, Reed set to work, his hands steady even as his heart raced. He gathered the spirits, their attention held by the gravity of his discovery. He read aloud the orders that sent them to their doom, the letters home that were never sent, and the official reports that erased their final stand from the annals of history. Recognition flickered in the eyes of the spectral soldiers, their unrest rooted in the betrayal that had stripped them of their dignity in death. Reed's revelation acted as a salve to their honor. His voice, now a conduit for truth, became the instrument of their salvation. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barracks, an ethereal calm settled over the ghostly battalion. The soldiers, their forms gaining clarity in these final moments, snapped to attention before Reed. It was a salute of deep respect, an acknowledgement of the peace they could now embrace. And with the sunrise painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, they faded from sight, their duty finally fulfilled, their valor acknowledged. Corporal Nathan Reed stood alone in the heart of Barracks Delta, the weight of his nocturnal campaign etched into his very soul. He had not just uncovered the hidden truth of these lost soldiers, he had restored their honor, and in doing so, had granted them the peace that had eluded them for decades. As he stepped outside, the building behind him was silent, its history of hauntings now at an end. Reed looked to the horizon where the new sun heralded the beginning of a day that was more than just a passage of time. It was a demarcation. The spirits of Barracks Delta had departed, but their story would live on, no longer a ghostly whisper, but a clear voice in the history of the brave. The sun rose on a new era for the barracks, indeed, but also for Reed, who had fought the most unconventional battle of his career, not with weapons, but with the power of truth and honor. He walked away a changed man, the shadows of yesterday dispelled by the light he had brought forth. His bravery was a testament to the soldiers of Barracks Delta, and his legacy would be the peace that now dwelled where unrest once reigned.